Okay, this is for Business 436 for the quiz you're having. Just a couple things I just wanted to go over just to remind you, for instance, on the lemonade stand, how we did things. And I'm just going to use one of the examples. I'll use the powdered expected. And what I would do is do it the way that I do is I separate everything with the variable cost, the fixed period cost, the primary sunk investment, basically like this actually. Variable cost, fixed period cost, primary sunk investment, and then what other information they give you that you can actually use to figure out some of this stuff. I would do it that way. Then you're separating everything and you got everything right. Then once you've got this information, then you could figure out the unit contribution on, per unit. In this case, on the one problem that we did, we did it annually, remember? And you can just go back to the video to look for this. And then you figure out your contribution margin annually and then subtract from that your primary sunk investment if you're paying it back down here the first year, and then add to it the second year's contribution, which is basically your profit, and that's how much you walk away after 2 years. But so I would organize everything this way. Remember to bring your calculator, okay? But just to go through it, it's similar to what you guys did on the lemonade stand. Here's all the information, like I had in that separate column, the different information. They calculated some of it out, okay? And then you've got your revenue per cup, your variable cost per cup, gives you your contribution margin, okay? And then once you've got your contribution margin, you figure out what your fixed period cost. In this case, it was just $1. You divide it by your contribution margin. That tells you how many days or hours, whatever. I forget what this one was. Basically, this is your break even. Remember the difference between break even and payout, which I call payback, but payout, which is basically paying off your primary sunk investment. Then this was just going through and figuring out your gross revenue per day, because it's revenue per cup, which came from up here, times the number of cups. This is just basically, if you think about it logically, it's pretty logical. So that's your revenue per day, your variable cost per day, your fixed period cost per day. So that's your contribution per day or per week or per month, per year, whatever period of time. And that's kind of what we were doing on the other side over here, where you had your contribution margin times how many hours in a year gave you your contribution margin for the year, minus your fixed period cost, which gave you your contribution margin, which is basically your profit for the year, before you pay off the primary sunk investment in this case. So that's where you're at. Again, here, this is just like we were right here. This is our contribution margin per year. This is the contribution margin per day. Then your primary sunk investment, since you only made $650 per day, you couldn't pay it off in one day. It took 2.3 days. Excuse me, this is the part that is actually for the yearly basis, or for the period of time. So then you knew that you were in operation for 10 days. This is the part that has to do with what I was just talking about. So you got your revenue for the total 10 days. You got your cost of goods sold, which are your variable costs. COGS, cost of goods sold. Okay. Your fixed period costs are your selling, general, and administrative expenses, SG&A. Selling expenses, general expenses, and administrative expenses. That's basically your overhead. Your fixed period costs are basically your overhead. Okay, they have nothing to do directly with the product being manufactured. Selling expenses like marketing, general, just different general things like utility and that, and administrative like an office manager, sales manager, whatever, production manager. Well, maybe not production manager, but okay. And then you get your, subtract those, so you get your revenue per month, per year, per week, whatever. Subtract your variable costs, subtract your fixed period costs, which are your selling, general, and administrative costs, get you your net income. Then you subtract from it, if you can, your primary sunk investment. And then that tells you, remember this was a 1/3, 2/3 split. So we basically get a net income of 65. You minus the 15, so that was 50. And then your brother got 1/3 of that and you got 2/3 of it. Okay, they might do interest differently. They might do it for the whole year. It might do 10% per year. If you pay it off in half a year, though, remember you're only paying interest for half a year in that case. If you pay it off in half a year, if it takes you, he may do it this way where there's a split because it makes it a little bit easier than trying to figure out how much interest was paid for what period of time it took you to pay off the primary sunk investment. But just say, for instance, you paid the primary sunk investment off at the end of the year. That means the interest would be for the entire 12 months. So if it was 10%, you'd have that interest charge of 10%, which would be another expense, right? In this case, they just split it 1/3, 2/3, I think, just to make it easier on you guys. So that this part of here isn't any different than what we did here. Contribution margin minus your fixed period costs, this is your contribution margin, which is your price minus your variable costs. You could have your overall revenue. Here it is right here, actually. I'm sorry. Here's your overall revenue minus your variable costs. That gives you the contribution margin. They left that part out, the contribution margin part out. Well, net income, they did have it as net income. You subtract your fixed period costs. That gives you your contribution margin. That's your net income. I'm sorry. This would be your net income. That's comparative to what we were talking about. Sorry. It's the same thing. Revenues minus variable costs minus your fixed period costs, which are your selling, general, administrative, gives you your net income. Revenue minus your variable cost minus your fixed period cost gives you your net profit. Okay, from that you subtract your primary sunk investment, which was 52,000 in this case. Now they asked you, it would be 132,600, but they asked you how much you'd have after 2 years. Well, for the second year, you don't have to pay off the primary sunk investment, so you add the whole 184,600 to get this. I just wanted to make sure you understood the difference between this, and his example for those two sample questions didn't have interest involved, but you might have to do an interest where it's a split like this, like 1/3, 2/3, or it might be 10% interest per year, or 12%. If it's 12%, it's 1% per month. And then if you pay off the primary sunk investment in 6 months, then you're only paying interest for 6 months. So I just wanted you to understand that. All these formats are pretty much the same, the three that you see. This one here, this one that we did for the second problem, sample problem, or this one. They're all kind of, just as long as you understand the relationship, then it's all pretty simple. Revenue minus variable cost minus fixed period cost gives you your income, net income. That gives you your net income because your primary sunk investment, paying that back is not an expense. If you got the money, you'll pay it back, but it's not something that is one of these, it's not a variable cost, it's not a fixed period cost, it's something that you want to pay back at a certain period of time as soon as you can. So then you subtract that after your net income. So see how it's got net income minus less the PSI, the primary sunk investment. Because if you don't have the money, you don't have to pay that back. It's not a fixed period cost, it's a sunk investment. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure you understood the relationship. But when you're figuring out the problems, separate the variable costs, the fixed period costs, primary sunk investment, and then the general information so that you could figure out the contribution margin. You can figure out the break even, which is the fixed period cost divided by the unit contribution. That may be for, they may want it in weeks, they may want it in months. You got to just multiply. In this case, they wanted it by year, so we multiplied it times 52 weeks times 200 hours per week. I mean, the number of units, I'm sorry. 52 weeks times 200 units to get a unit contribution times the number of units that were produced. Okay, so hopefully that helps you out.